So, Columbia University has actually been in the news quite a bit lately, for all the wrong reasons, of course. Now, many of my viewers may not know this, but I'm actually a Columbia College graduate myself. Go class of 1993. And I actually did my 4 years on that campus and in New York City. And of course, I also hung out at the same dining halls, the dorms, and the classrooms that are right now in the media today. Now, while the current violent activists that are breaking windows and taking hostages or occupying Hamilton Hall, or maybe we're actually going to rename it Hamas Hall now, you're seeing them on the news today, but it may seem shocking to some, but it actually turns out that the very same type of kind of crazy pro-Hamas students that you see on the media right now, with their tents on the lawn and the quad, they were actually attending that school when I was there too, just 30 years ago. Now, back then, they were also on kind of a stupid hunger strike, and they were harassing students coming out of the dining hall for not joining them in their virtue-signaling tent and blue tarp crusade that they had on campus. So what did I actually do at the time as a fellow student on campus, annoyed at the obnoxious kind of cult-like virtue-signaling rich kids that were doing this? Well, I did the same thing that any good conservative activist would do. I got together with some of my friends and we organized a barbecue right next to the tents, the blue tarps, and the dumb virtue signaling kind of hunger strikers. Now, these same people, of course, had also taken over Hamilton Hall back in the early 1990s too. And they assaulted students back then, just like they've done recently. And by the way, it's always what these crazies end up doing. I mean, since 1968, whenever a crazy woke mob gets riled up on Columbia campus, they always take over Hamilton Hall. I mean, this is just as predictable as the sun rising tomorrow. They don't usually have to use a hammer to break the windows, but that building's always the target, just every single time. However, one thing I do remember back then was getting just a bit of advance notice, and I do remember that my friends and I, we went and removed all the toilet paper from the Hamilton Hall restrooms under the perfectly rational assumption that the trust fund rich kids playing radical activists today wouldn't last long without toilet paper. And while they might want to chant death to America or make Israel Jew-free, we rightly suspected that they wouldn't stop to sacrifice their socks to endure their occupation of Hamilton Hall very long. Now, have they renamed it Hamas Hall yet? I'm not sure, and I guess we'll have to see. So let's just dig into the drama of what is actually happening on college campuses today and what it means for the rest of us now. Now, first of all, crazy protests at Columbia are hardly unique today. In 1968, before I was even born, there were a series of campus protests and drama and building takeovers and police arrests of protesters on campus. Now, back then, a lot of the people taking over the buildings weren't even students. Just like many of these protesters today, they aren't students either. Now, in 1968, there was actually a kind of a combination of rich white students who wanted the school to not be affiliated with the military-industrial complex. And, of course, this included the Students for Democratic Society, or SDS, as well as some of who would turn out to be a future weathermen, which was a locally kind of violent terrorist crew later on involved in the campus drama. This is before they became weathermen. Now, there's nothing new about students demanding that the school divest itself from something. Yep, it certainly does sound familiar, but as always, there's nothing new under the sun, and these divestment protests currently, they've been happening at Columbia now for over 55 years at least now. Now, in the 1968 protests, there was also a protest about a planned school gym in Morningside Park, which was viewed by some students and neighborhood radicals as kind of a racially segregated project because it was designed with a community gym facility with an access from the lower part of Morningside Park, kind of serving the Harlem neighborhood, and then with a college gym access, which would be access kind of from the higher levels up off of 116th Street. Now, this was viewed as segregationist at the time, and it generated a protest that actually did racially segregate itself at the very same time between the black students and the black community members who occupied Hamilton Hall, and then the white protesters who eventually went and occupied Low Library. I'm going to point out that, just for the record, that the black students and the black community members at the time, they didn't break any windows or trash Hamilton Hall, unlike the Hamas crew currently occupying that building today. And I'm also going to point out that the school's plans to build that community gym ended up just coming to a complete and abrupt end at that time, which really helped ensure that Morningside Park became a great place for drug dealers and criminal gangs to fight over as kind of part of their endless turf wars that criminals, they basically prized so much, really, for so many decades back then. I remember actually watching gunfights at night from the Columbia College dorms on the hill, and you could actually watch the muzzle flashes as various drug dealers and criminals battled for control, and the police eventually would get there to join in the drama. Now, back during the 1968 protests, there was also a large group of regular students on campus who just really wanted to get an education, graduate, and move on with their lives. And they felt that the protests were destroying the campus, and the pathetic college administration was doing nothing to stop it. So these students actually attempted to blockade Low Library to prevent more protesters and outsiders from joining in this occupation and allowing people to leave and then kind of prevent them from getting more food supplies. Now, you can actually see some old videos from that time of the students for Democrat Society, or SDS, inside the building, kind of getting their supporters to throw food over the student blockade of the buildings. Now, the pathetic school administration at the time finally became concerned about the violence between student groups, those who opposed the protest tactics and those who were occupying the buildings. So, of course, this was after they sent in a team of police to rescue a famous Rembrandt painting that was hanging in the building for fear that the students would actually vandalize this priceless treasure. Now, the racially segregated protests had actually very different endings at the time. The black students and community members who had occupied Hamilton Hall, along with local community members, eventually left in cooperation with the New York Police Department, who really bent over backwards at the time to kind of avoid this perception of a riot because of the Martin Luther King assassination that had actually just happened a few weeks before. And then there were very much significant concerns that with the increased riots in cities all over America at the time, the New York police really didn't want a riot in the Harlem neighborhood. However, removing the rich, mostly white students who occupied Low Library became a violent event, with over 700 arrested, 135 students injured, 4 faculty members that were injured, and a number of police officers were also injured, and there was actually a police officer who was severely injured, became disabled when a student jumped out of a second-story window onto his back. Now, the police used tear gas and batons to arrest and clear Low Library that day, and the images actually shocked a lot of people all around the country at the time. Now, Hamilton Hall is also a building where many of us students had our classes and in-person finals at the time, back in the early 1990s when I was there. And a lot of real students who just didn't have rich parents who could afford to cover bonus extra expense semesters on campus, and who, strangely enough, actually wanted decent grades. They were frustrated and angry when they were prevented from taking their finals. This was back when they took over Hamilton Hall when I was there. And I remember this distinctly in the 1990s. The socialists and the wokesters on campus at the time were flailing for a cause, and many of the wannabe radicals were kind of upset after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and this kind of clear failure of the socialist utopian experiments around the world back then. And the Gulf War, of course, had happened in the early 1990s, and this had kind of generated a short spike in anti-war protests for a few months, but that kind of petered out with a whimper after that conflict ended so abruptly. Now, by the time the woke students of my era occupied Hamilton Hall, they claimed to be opposed to Columbia University's use of the nearby Audubon Ballroom, which is where Malcolm X had been assassinated in 1965. And then the mostly rich white trust fund students who had occupied Hamilton Hall, they claimed that it was racist to do anything with that building. Of course it was. So in 1993, the Columbia University actually called the New York Police Department once again to arrest the occupiers of Hamilton Hall. But the occupying trust fund kids, they ran away rather than get arrested. I was there, and it was just a farcical protest by rich kids who wanted to experience some kind of echo of the glory days of their leftist parents and then bask in the pretense of being a radical for at least a few hours. Now, it probably seemed cool to them, but the coolness factor wore itself out as they realized there was just really no toilet paper left in that building. Now, something else to consider for places like Columbia University and these other college campuses where they're basically allowing this lawless and increasingly violent organized protest effort expand right now. Columbia actually suffered great financial and prestige loss after the 1968 riots on campus. Not surprisingly, enrollment significantly dropped, and many prospective students simply chose less crazy places to attend college. The college endowments collapsed at the time for many years, and the school was in a financial spiral for quite some time. Most people estimate that it took 20 years for the school to actually overcome this ugly reputation that it had earned from the 1968 campus riots. Now, I attended the university more than 20 years after 1968, but the shadow of those days had actually still loomed large over the campus. And while we avoided the same violent drama of 1968 when I was there, this is only because the socialist crew was less capable and more incompetent than their parents had actually been. Today, however, I suspect that Columbia is actually facing another serious question on their campus. And like the decisions made back in 1968, the damage done to their reputation will impact them now for probably many years, if not decades, to come. This has nothing to do with free speech. The modern wokesters and these Hamas socialists kind of on campus, they've been striving for years to silence free speech and any expression that doesn't conform to their orthodoxy of the day. Now, I know because I experienced this when I attended the school, too. They tried to silence Dinesh D'Souza when I actually brought him to campus, and they would heckle other speakers that we brought. However, at least we were able to bring them, and we presented a different perspective than the one that was pushed by kind of this left-leaning agenda crew at the time. The weird thing to me now, watching this happen at my alma mater once again, is the obvious fact that these protesters haven't really come up with anything new in half a century of their revolution for the people, or Hamas, or whatever it happens to be that day. Rather than any type of intellectual debate or argument, they just descend into kind of dumb chants, stupid tents, and occupying buildings. Just the same old, same old. Nothing seems to change. It's the same old 1968 tactics with just a weird anti-Jew racist twist this time. Now, the hand-wringing and probably useless overpaid administrators, they just kind of flounder around, completely aware that they're trying to put on some type of normal facade for their graduation ceremony, which happens really in just a few weeks. In this exact same quad location that's currently occupied by the tents that the administration essentially needs to clean up. I mean, these guys are normally very good at raising money, and they know that if the visiting alumni and parents see the school recovering from some kind of a war zone of chaos, that their contributions are certainly going to drop. And they already are dropping, but how far will the drop actually go? However far it drops, it will be exactly what they deserve, because it is this very same kind of weak administration that sets the policies and then refuses to enforce them, except when they can silence conservatives on campus, of course, who, oddly enough, never seem to break windows or occupy buildings or take janitors hostage or preach about making Israel Jew-free. Now, listen, the topic of free speech and hate speech often comes up when we discuss these types of violent protests. And as nasty and ugly as the hateful rhetoric has been at Columbia and elsewhere, this has actually protected free speech, even the ugly racist statements that they make. Where the free speech argument fails, however, is when they violently take janitors hostage in Hamilton Hall, for example. I mean, it isn't free speech any longer to break the windows or block the graduation ceremony. It isn't free speech when you threaten people of targeted ethnicity in some type of racist attack and then prevent them from actually entering the campus, as this pro-Hamas crew is right now doing to Jewish students. Now, free speech isn't really protected anymore when it descends into active calls for violence, just like the recently expelled Columbia student who was essentially claiming that people who he doesn't like, they don't have a right to life, Zionists or Jews or whatever he wants to call them. Now, I believe that the students who actually commit violence and make violent threats should be held accountable. And like all schools that have a code of conduct, if you go this far off the reservation of just decent behavior, then being expelled from college is probably the least penalty that you should receive or expect as a result. Now, Columbia, just like pretty much other universities and colleges today, they're suffering the consequences of kind of creating this campus culture where the craziest extremists are allowed to silence and intimidate the rest of the community into acquiescing to these unhinged demands. Plenty of the faculty there today, just like in my college student days, are actually former radicals themselves. And they're incapable of restraining or even attempting to restrain the violent tendencies that we see in these types of activities on campus. Now, regardless of their tough talk today, I think they're actually unlikely to truly enforce their community standards on the students, unless they actually find some conservative students that they want to go and punish. The diversity, inclusion, and equity agenda is very clearly racist. It's an ugly thing, and it's always going to descend into some type of oppressor versus victim narrative that's designed to create division, irrational hatred, and permanent enmity between groups of people. The Columbia administration has jumped on this bandwagon and basically patted themselves on the back for doing so. But when you sow these seeds of hatred and division, it won't take long before you see Hamas protesters trying to make the campus Juden frei. I mean, it is an ugly and shocking thing for most Americans to witness, and social media amplifies the results for everyone to see now, something I didn't have when I was in college. Now, I read an article recently titled, "Mama, Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Activists." It's based, of course, on the song, "Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys." It was a funny and sad article that was written by an author looking at the same ugly drama unfolding before us today and seeing nothing but hatred, violence, and evil results in this unfolding drama right now on campus. It is hard to imagine anything good coming out of mobs chanting to purge the Jews from Israel or Columbia today. If it shocks you, it really should. And it should shock everyone. But those of us who have experienced these crazies firsthand, we know this is who they are. And now that they feel encouraged to share their views with everyone else, perhaps it's time for all of us to actually become activists, not run from it. Unlike the crazed, kind of dumb cult-like chants and then hostage-taking or building occupiers, however, our activism should revisit the divestment demands and maybe do some of our own divestment. We can start by no longer subsidizing these private institutions with our tax dollars. In times of financial stress, why is the federal government sending $1.2 billion per year to Columbia University? I mean, think about that. It's a lot of tax dollars. That should actually stop. We should demand that it stops, and it would be a good place for divestment to start. Just stop sending the tax dollars to these places. Also, why are the alumni blindly sending their cash to them in the first place? And that should dry up right now as well. And there should be some sort of effort made to just encourage others to stop sending those checks. I mean, why would you let your children attend these places? Because their education, whatever that means in this type of environment, certainly won't be worth the cost. And it might even damage your children if they go there. Now, I don't want my kids to turn into the racists and race-obsessed crazies that I see chanting at these rallies, and I suspect that you and most parents don't either. Now, finally, if you're actually a student and a good student who might consider a place like Columbia, why would you even apply? I mean, you can go to many other schools where you might actually get to experience a normal graduation ceremony without tents and garbage, or blue tarps or hostage taking. And if you don't go to Columbia, you might be able to attend classes without crazy screaming at you about purging the Jews. And who knows, you might be able to actually learn something more than how to win a game of beer pong or try to figure out where you exist on the grievance culture hierarchy of victimhood Olympics. The collapse of higher education that we're witnessing today is not an accident. It is the inevitable and predicted outcome of these destructive ideologies that are promoted and endorsed by faculty, administration, and then these left-leaning special interests who essentially control these campuses today. Abandoning merit, rational thought, and free speech, abandoning real free speech without the heckler's veto that we see on college campuses today, will inevitably lead to just crazy, ugly drama like what we are witnessing right now at Columbia. Now, this won't stop soon unless we see major consequences on the college campuses that encourage this behavior, really, or discourage it anyway. Until then, if you don't want to witness more scenes of kind of crazed college students demanding that their campus become Jew-free, down with America, or worse, then you and I, all we have to do, we have to get involved. We must show up, and we must stop subsidizing this type of thing. And it starts with us. We have to divest from this weird hate cult growing on campuses today, and we can encourage others to stop subsidizing it as well. And I say this because we all have something that we can do to stop it in some small way, but we do have to show up and make that impact because the future inevitably belongs to those who show up.